The History of Philosophy, Modern Philosophy, Kant to the Present. Lecture 9.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, let us begin. Last week we spent the last half of the lecture on logical positivism, and we saw that viewpoint culminate in a very distinctive view of what is the nature and proper function of philosophy. The nature and proper function of philosophy, according to the logical positivists, was to analyze. The philosopher is an analyst, a clarifier of other people's thoughts. As a philosopher, he does not, according to this view, have any distinctive subject matter of his own. There are no characteristic or distinctive philosophic questions. All the traditional branches of philosophy, which old-fashioned philosophers thought belonged to philosophy, such as metaphysics, ethics, politics, aesthetics, these are dismissed on principle as being inappropriate fields of investigation. The philosopher, in effect, runs a clearinghouse, if you remember. He scrutinizes the utterances of people, for the positivists primarily of scientists, and if those utterances turn out to be empirical, he farms them out to the appropriate empirical scientist. If those utterances turn out to be analytic, then he farms them out to the appropriate logician or mathematician. And above all, if they turn out to be metaphysical, then he hoists the flag and says that they are meaningless and can't be discussed. Now, that was one form in which philosophy early reached the conclusion, philosophers did, that philosophy is essentially an activity of analysis. Now, this evening our subject is the development of the analyst movement, subsequently the contemporary analyst movement. And in the first half this evening I want to say something about certain other figures who were not themselves positivists, but who were also very influential in the genesis and development of the contemporary analyst movement. And first I want to turn to a philosopher whose name is G.E. Moore, the spelling of which is obvious, one of the patron saints of the later analyst movement. He was born in 1873 and he died only recently. He represents a different route by which we reach pretty much the same type of conclusion, namely that philosophy is essentially an activity of analysis. Now, I may say for accuracy that Moore himself denied this. He was a more old-fashioned philosopher himself. He was not, for instance, opposed to metaphysics as such. He did do some work in ethics, so by no stretch could you call him a positivist. He didn't personally equate philosophy with analysis. However, his basic method and approach to philosophy were precursors of today's analysts, and while they disagree with much of the more old-fashioned elements in him, they have a very great reverence for certain aspects, at least, of his philosophy, and that's the aspect that we will be looking at. Now, in turning to Moore, I say at the outset that there is very little content to Moore's philosophy. If you look through his collected works, which are very thin in amount, you'll find some discussions of sense perception, of the question of realism versus idealism, volume or two on ethics, many refutations of individual points from other philosophers, a few odds and ends, and that's about it. In terms of his actual practice, he was not interested in constructing a systematic positive philosophy with an overall metaphysics and theory of knowledge. That was not his way of coming at philosophy. His point of departure was in the peculiar things which other philosophers had said on philosophic subjects. You get the impression from reading him that if there had been no previous philosophers, Moore would never have philosophized. You get the impression that he was, so to speak, minding his own business, when suddenly some philosopher comes along and utters some monstrous proposition. For instance, a Hegelian will come into the room and say time is unreal. Time being, you see, just a feature of this world of appearances, and in the absolute there is no time. Moore will hear the philosopher utter the proposition time is unreal. His ire is aroused, and he rises to the assault to defend time against such an attack. And he does that with a number of different equivalent types of proposition. As such, his philosophy is necessarily very piecemeal. There are a lot of separate, comparatively short articles concentrating on specific propositions, usually those uttered by other philosophers. His viewpoint is therefore very disconnected and very unsystematic. Insofar as he has positive views, they're largely unoriginal, and it all adds up to very little. His main object of focus, as I say, was on the propositions uttered by other philosophers. And if I quote more from memory an essential summary of his attitude on this respect, he once wrote something to this effect: "I do not think that the world of the sciences would ever have suggested any philosophic questions to me. What has suggested philosophic questions is things which philosophers have said about the world and the sciences." That's essentially his way of coming at philosophy. Well, what sort of things did philosophers say that caught his attention? What sort of propositions did he focus on? Well, in general, the outlandish, outrageous propositions that were frequently uttered by traditional philosophers in various schools. For instance, you know there were idealists, and characteristically an idealist would come out with the proposition, material objects are unreal. Or there were Hegelians, as we mentioned, who would come out and say time is unreal. And there was a certain type whom we haven't mentioned in this course who pondered over what he called the problem of other minds. And the problem of other minds is, since you have no direct access to anybody else's mind but your own, how do you know other people have minds? How do you know that everybody else other than you is not simply a brilliantly constructed, intricate robot completely devoid of consciousness? And they puzzled over that, and there were certain philosophers who said there are no other minds. And of course there were skeptics who said nobody can be certain of anything, and so on. Now when Moore would hear propositions of this sort, time is unreal, there are no other minds, nobody can be certain of anything, he was outraged. He regarded propositions of this sort, and validly so, as simply ridiculous. And he pointed out that the philosophers who advocated these type of propositions constantly in their behavior contradicted the propositions that they were uttering. A philosopher would give a disquisition on the thesis that material objects are unreal, and then blithely go to a supermarket to purchase a pound of butter for his wife without turning a hair. He would say, and I have seen a case of this, time is unreal, propound this, and then look at his watch and say, I'm sorry, I've got to catch the train, it's late, and so on. In other words, they would preach these theories, but their own practical conduct, the needs of actual everyday life, was inconsistent with the theory they advocated. And Moore was very vigorous to point this out. Now, to that extent, you would say, so far, so good. But of course, as I think you would understand, if you were really to give a philosophic refutation of these various outlandish propositions that I mentioned, what you would need to do is provide a whole systematic positive philosophy. You would have to establish a metaphysics of existence and consciousness. You would have to provide definitions of all the fundamental philosophic concepts and a methodology validating your definitions, a methodology as to how you do know how to validate definitions, and that of course would involve you in providing a theory of concepts. If you wanted to claim that man can be certain, you'd have to provide an analysis of what does certainty consist of and under what conditions is it attainable. In other words, you need a whole metaphysics and epistemology worked out in detail in order to answer the arguments of these various philosophers and establish the positive viewpoint. Now, Moore's point, therefore, about the fact that these philosophers are inconsistent with their own theories is a pertinent observation, but it's only, of course, a preliminary observation. It's not a final and definitive answer to these philosophers. The fact is, however, that Moore did not have very much more to offer by way of answering these traditional philosophers, and so he has often been criticized as being a profoundly, deeply superficial philosopher. His essential point was that we can answer all of these philosophers strictly by reference to one capacity which we all possess, a capacity which he called common sense. Common sense. He said in order to answer these type of views, we do not have to engage in argument or proof or reasoning. We do not have to construct a whole systematic philosophy to defend our positive views. Rather, he said, there is a whole host of propositions put forth by traditional philosophers that we can know without any argument at all to be false. And on the other hand, there is a whole host of propositions that human beings can see without any argument or proof of any sort to be true with certainty. And if we ask how in these various cases do we know with certainty that this proposition is false and this proposition is true, Moore's answer is simply the appeal to common sense. We just know by means of common sense. Now, in 1925, he wrote his famous article outlining this view, entitled A Defense of Common Sense. In a way, it's Moore's manifesto, and I will read you a brief extract from it. You'll see the level and type of things that he believes can be established by common sense. These are the sort of things he claims to know with certainty to be true by means of common sense, and I think the style of this passage will be as revealing of the mentality and the level of approach here as the content of it. I quote from you. I quote now from A Defense of Common Sense, quote, "There exists at present a living human body which is my body. This body was born at a certain time in the past and has existed continuously ever since. Ever since it was born, it has been in contact with or not far from the surface of the earth." See, we have to be very precise here. He may have jumped at one point, so we put that in. "And at every moment since it was born, there have also existed many other things having shape and size in 3 dimensions from which it has been at various distances. Among the things which have, in this sense, formed part of its environment have been large numbers of other living human bodies." I skip a bit and then he goes on. "Finally, I am a human being and I have had many different experiences. For example, I have often perceived my own body and other things which form part of its environment, including other human bodies, etc., etc." That gives you an idea. Now, you see, this is not exactly what one would call an impassioned philosophic manifesto. But his distinctive point was that it is unnecessary to argue or give any logical defense of all these sorts of propositions. You know them all simply by common sense. Well, of course, that raises the question, what is common sense and how does Moore validate it? Its claims to being a distinctive cognitive faculty. Unfortunately, to make a long story short, he never offered a clear definition or criterion of what common sense consisted of, nor was there any sustained attempt on his part to validate it. It's a mixture of many different elements as he uses it. I will not painstakingly plow through them all. If you should by any chance be interested, there is a book by Alan White entitled G.E. Moore, in which he goes through Moore's analysis of common sense, or Moore's concept of it, and tries to disentangle the various strands involved. None of that is too important for our purposes if you get an idea of the level of this approach. I will give you one famous example of Moore's use of his common sense method. He gave a famous so-called proof of the external world by the use of the common sense method. You know, of course, the idealist school, for instance, the followers of Bishop Berkeley, I believe we have referred to them in previous lectures, held that there was no external physical world. What we call physical things are simply clusters of experiences in the mind, and therefore all that exists are minds contemplating their own inner experiences, and there is no external physical world at all. And they gave complex arguments in favor of this view, and it was a long, protracted philosophic debate between them and the realists, on the other hand, who said, no, there is an external, independent physical world. Well, Moore was, of course, very opposed to the idealists. He addressed a prominent group of philosophers one day and put forth the following decisive answer to the idealists. Quote, it's a very short proof, so you better listen. Quote, I can prove now, for instance, that two human hands exist. How? By holding up my two hands and saying, as I make a certain gesture with the right hand, here is one hand, and adding as I make a certain gesture with the left, and here is another. And if by doing this I have proved ipso facto the existence of external things, you will all see that I can also do it now in numbers of other ways. There is no need to multiply examples. Unquote. That's the end of the proof of the external world. Now, of course, needless to say, an idealist would not turn a hair in the face of an alleged demonstration of that kind. An idealist would say, well, what do you mean by hand? A follower of Berkeley says, I don't deny that we experience hands, but the question is, what do you mean by hand? If you interpret hand as simply a cluster of experiences that follow one another in a certain fashion in our minds, then I, the idealist, he would say, I agree that there's a hand, but I don't agree that there is an external material world. So the idealist would say, in short, you really are assuming the very point at issue. If you assume in advance that by hand you mean external material object, you're already assuming that there's an external material object. You're begging the question. In other words, an idealist would not be impressed. He would say to Moore, you're supposed to be giving me a proof that there's a hand in the sense of an external material object. To which Moore answers, quote, this, of course, I haven't given, and I do not believe it can be given. If this is what is meant by proof of the existence of external things, I do not believe that any proof of the existence of external things is possible, unquote. Well, you see that this is not exactly what one would call a profound analysis of the question of the external world. Now let's pursue for a moment the point that I just made. The objector to Moore would say, well, it depends what you mean by the statement, this is a hand. Remember, if you mean this is an external material object, then the idealist would say, no, this statement is false. If you mean by hand a cluster of experiences in the mind, then the idealist would say yes. So he would say, before we can discuss the truth of this proposition, we must first, as philosophers, specify its meaning. And you think that's a clear-cut view, but Moore, however, considers this entirely false. He says it is not necessary for philosophers to specify in advance the meaning of the common sense statements that they make, such as this is a hand and so on. He says all these common sense statements have a perfectly clear meaning. Everybody knows perfectly well what they mean. A statement like, he says, this is a hand, is the most unambiguous type of statement that there is. There's a perfectly standard, ordinary meaning, and everybody knows its ordinary meaning because its meaning is simply a matter of ordinary usage. You can remember that phrase, ordinary usage. We'll come back to it after the break. If you speak English, you just know what the meaning of such statements are. Consequently, it's not up to philosophy or philosophers to discuss or validate the meanings of the terms we use or the propositions which we put forth. Ordinary usage tells us what terms mean. Common sense tells us that certain propositions are true. You've got that division. Ordinary usage tells us what statements mean. Common sense tells us whether they're true. Well, now we reach the question then, what is there then for philosophers to do? What is left as the distinctive job or function of philosophy? We know the meaning of all the cardinal propositions that we utter from ordinary usage. We know their truth from common sense. So what is there left for the philosopher to do? Well, Moore's view is that although we know their meaning independently of philosophy, and although we know their truth independently of philosophy, what we don't know is how to interpret them. We don't know how to give what Moore called their analysis. So the function of philosophy is to provide not the meaning of a statement, not the truth of the statement, but the analysis of the statement. Now, Moore was unfortunately never very clear what he meant by the analysis of the statement, but I'll give you an example of what would pass for analysis by Moore. Suppose we take that statement, I see a material object. For instance, I see a hand. Now we know what it means without needing any recourse to philosophy. And we know that it's true by reference to common sense without needing any philosophy. But where does philosophy come in? Well, it's to provide an analysis. Well, what would be an analysis? Well, for instance, one philosopher might say, I interpret that to mean that there is an independently real object out there which I'm perceiving. That would be a realist type of analysis. And another philosopher, for instance, one influenced by John Stuart Mill, would interpret it as being, well, I simply observe a series of sense data, and those sense data will continue in a certain well-behaved pattern. That would be a John Stuart Mill type of analysis. Or a Kantian philosopher would interpret it as, I don't see reality, I see the effects, the appearance of reality to me given my particular type of mind. Now, all of those philosophers, according to Moore, will agree on the meaning of the statement, and all of them will agree on the truth of the statement, but they will give these different interpretations, what he called these different analyses of the statement. And that is the province of philosophy, to engage in analyses of this sort. But I stress that these analyses do not have to be provided in order to know either the meaning or the truth of the proposition. The proposition is meaningful prior to any analysis, and it's true apart from philosophic analysis. So the analysis that the philosopher provides adds nothing whatever to our knowledge of the facts. The analysis as such is redundant as far as our knowledge of the facts is concerned. In other words, whatever answer you come up with on the level of analysis, it doesn't make any practical difference. Now you see, this is in strong contrast to traditional philosophers who held that a philosopher has to define and validate our basic concepts, otherwise we wouldn't know what they meant or that they were true. For Moore, this is not at all the province of philosophy. What is the purpose of giving this type of analysis for Moore? Well, in essence, and to cut through a lot of jargon, it really is useless. For Moore, analysis is a technical pastime for those who are interested. It doesn't give us any more knowledge of the world than we already possess by common sense. It is, he says, extremely difficult to do satisfactorily, and even if we had it, it would make no difference to the deliverances of common sense and the meanings established by ordinary usage. It amounts to a professional game. So we have the conclusion that philosophy is not necessary to know the facts of reality. Philosophy is in effect a technical afterthought for those interested in intellectual puzzles. There are, so to speak, two different levels on which human beings function. There's the level of common sense and the level of analysis, and these two are split, removed from each other. And philosophy is consigned to the level that is removed from life. The philosopher simply solves intellectual puzzles as an end in itself without it having any practical life significance. Now, this is a very brief sketch of one road by which we reach today's analysts and the view that philosophy is essentially analysis of language and cut off from practical life. Let's leave Moore now and turn to another philosopher of a rather different sort who was influential on the development of modern analysis, and that is, of course, Bertrand Russell, one of the fathers of the analysts. Bertrand Russell was 1872 to 1970. By way of introduction, I should point out that Russell has written, he's now finally finished writing, but he has written an enormous amount on virtually all possible subjects. So in this respect, he's the opposite of Moore. He has a shelf after shelf of works. He has changed his philosophic position a great number of times. He is pretty much a Heraclitean intellectual. You can never step in the same Russell twice. He started as an admirer of Hegel, and then under Moore's influence he became a common-sense realist. He has at various stages and in various moods been a follower of Plato and an advocate of at time the spaceless world of universals, and of course at other moods he's strenuously opposed this view. In certain passages he has held that logic and mathematics is merely linguistic conventions and has advocated various versions of the verifiability principle, and in other passages he has held that logic and mathematics is based upon facts of reality and criticized the verifiability principle, and he's even criticized empiricism as such. So to give you anything like a full account of Russell would involve something like a recapitulation of the whole history of philosophy. He has, however, been very influential on the analysts, and it's from that point of view that we will look at him. He's one of the prime movers in the analyst movement. He often emphasized that linguistic and grammatical confusions and ambiguities are responsible for much of traditional philosophy. And he has held for a long time that one major function of philosophy is analysis. Analysis of the ways philosophers are misled by language. And it's from that aspect that we'll look at. Now, there's a number of difficulties in presenting him even from this aspect, and even discounting the number of changes in his views that he underwent. His philosophy is, on principle, very piecemeal and unsystematic in character. He believed that we in philosophy should emulate the scientists. We should study separate, individual, isolated, limited questions, one point at a time. He was opposed to the grand way of doing philosophy, that is the overall systematic approach where you have a metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, which follows, and so on. Consequently, it does not lend itself to easy summary because it's a number of isolated piecemeal points. Another reason for difficulty in synopsizing his views is that they were highly technical. He did a lot of writing in the fields of logic and the foundations of mathematics. He was the author with Whitehead of the famous work Principia Mathematica, which came out from 1910 to 1913, and which claimed to show that all of mathematics is reducible to certain basic logical concepts and propositions. It was a very influential work in its day, but of course too technical for us to go into here. I will, however, give you an example or so from it, enough for you to get the message of what he was doing in it. The net effect, I may say, of the Principia has been to undermine Aristotelian logic and encourage, in quotes, free play on the part of philosophers in constructing logical systems. If you remember Carnap's statement that I quoted last week, in logic there are no morals, anything goes, everybody's free to build up the type of logic he wants. Well, these philosophers looked at the Principia, the structure that Russell and Whitehead built up in those volumes, and took that as the outstanding example of a non-Aristotelian logic, and proceeded from there, in effect, with a charter of liberation. Now, my procedure in looking at Russell is going to be simply, in no particular order, to give you a sprinkling of doctrines, a few characteristic ones to give you the flavor of Russell's approach to philosophy, I think you'll see without much difficulty that it's systematically destructive wherever we step in. Now, to begin with, Russell was dissatisfied with Moore's appeal to ordinary usage and ordinary language. You recall Moore and Russell were friendly through their lives. They had many conversations, back and forth colloquies. Moore had held that ordinary statements that the man on the street makes have clear, unambiguous meaning, and had said that philosophers could appeal to this ordinary meaning without any hesitation. Now, Russell, in common here with the positivist axis, takes a different view. He holds that ordinary language is misleading, unclear, ambiguous, confusing. Ordinary language meaning language as ordinary people speak it in their ordinary lives. He says that ordinary language constantly suggests falsehoods by the very way it's built. We must therefore not slavishly adhere to it, but reform it. In particular, he holds the grammatical structure of ordinary statements can be misleading, can suggest falsehoods to the unwary, and what we need to do, therefore, is reform, restructure, reorganize ordinary language until we erase the very possibility of uttering misleading statements. What we have to create, as it's sometimes put, is an ideal language. So I point out to you parenthetically that there is a split developed in the analyst movement between two schools, which are sometimes referred to as the ideal language analysts as opposed to the ordinary language analysts. The ordinary, both of these I may say are false, as we'll see as we get there, but the ordinary language school are the derivatives from Moore. They hold that ordinary usage is fine and is a proper guide for philosophers. We'll look at them after the break because they're the big ones today. The ideal language school, however, which gets much of its impetus from Russell and the positivists, holds that ordinary language is confusing, and we have to get rid of it and create a decent, non-confusing so-called ideal language. And Russell made many attempts toward the construction of such an ideal language. Here's a quote from him to this effect, quote, "We ought not in our attempts at serious thinking to be content with ordinary language, with its ambiguities and its abominable syntax. I remain convinced that obstinate addiction to ordinary language in our own private thoughts is one of the main obstacles to progress in philosophy." Unquote. Well, now you may ask me to give you an example of how ordinary language is ambiguous and misleading. Why do we have the need to throw it out and create an ideal language? Can I give you an example? And I will give you one from Russell. I'll give you now, if you're taking notes, what is called Russell's theory of definite descriptions. His theory of definite descriptions. This is one of many such theories that Russell elaborates, but after you get one, I'm sure you'll be satisfied. My purpose in giving you this is simply to give you an example of analysis as practiced by Russell. This was one of his celebrated theories, which caused a big stir at the time it was put forth, and it will be an example of why we cannot rely on ordinary language and by what process we'll go about getting a better language. As I may say in advance, that whatever qualms you had about Moore's use of common sense will not be conspicuously present in this theory. Russell did not have a high regard for common sense. He once delivered himself of the following utterance, quote, "The point of philosophy," now get this, "the point of philosophy is to start with something so simple as not to seem worth stating, and to end with something so paradoxical that no one will believe it," unquote. And I may say he obeyed this injunction religiously. All right, let's look at the theory of definite descriptions briefly. What do we mean by a definite description? Well, a definite description is any phrase which has the form the so-and-so. See, definite from the definite article, the word the. A phrase which supposedly describes one thing, in contrast to an indefinite description. You see, if I say a man, that's an indefinite description. But if I say, to take Russell's famous example, the author of Waverley, that is a definite description. Waverley is a novel by Scott, who is Scotch. That's the background you need here. Or if I say the Loch Ness Monster, or the man with the long beard at the North Pole, etc. Any phrase of the form the so-and-so is a definite description. Now you may ask, why would anybody pick on this type of phrase and make a big thing about it? Well, it poses an alleged philosophic problem, according to Russell. What is the problem? Well, these definite descriptions, the phrases, suggest by their wording that the reference of those phrases actually exist, when often they don't. Suppose, for instance, somebody talks about round squares in your presence, and you say there's no such thing as round squares. You utter the proposition, the round square doesn't exist. Or you say, the unicorn is a mythical creature. Or, one favorite example of these people is, you say, the present king of France is bald. And you say it in a republic, when France is a republic and it has no kings. Why you'd ever say it, they never say, but they just come in and you utter that. Now, what's the problem with these type of statements? Well, it says these statements are meaningful. If I say the round square doesn't exist, the unicorn is mythical, and so on. But to be meaningful, then the phrase, the definite description, has to, they claim, denote, name, or refer to something which exists. If I say the unicorn is a mythical creature, well, for the phrase the unicorn to be meaningful, it seems as though it must refer to something. And yet, in this case, there is no unicorn for it to refer to. So the question is, what do these phrases refer to, and how can you talk meaningfully about non-existence, you see? Now I should say that there were certain philosophers, among them one who's named Meinong, M-E-I-N-O-N-G, who took the bull by the horns in a crudely simple-minded way and said, well, if we refer to these things, they must actually somehow or other have being. If we deny that, if we say the unicorn is mythical and we can meaningfully refer to the unicorn, there must somehow be a unicorn, which is what we're referring to when we say the unicorn isn't around. Of course, the unicorn isn't in this world, so there were, for Meinong, there was, so to speak, a metaphysical underworld in which all the things that we could refer to but which didn't exist in this world existed, and we were referring to them in that other world. It was a world peopled by all the non-existence we could meaningfully refer to. And Russell at one stage held this view along with most others. Here's a quote from Russell at this early stage before he arrived at the theory of definite description. Quote, A is not implies that there is a term A whose being is denied, and hence that A is. You got that? Numbers, I'm continuing the quote, the Homeric gods, relations, chimeras, and four-dimensional spaces all have being. For if they were not entities of a kind, we could make no propositions about them, unquote. That's the problem. Now, I will interject in 2 sentences my answer to this problem before I give you Russell's, just in case that you think this is a problem. My answer would be that this is nonsense, that there is no valid problem here at all. Human beings possess the power of abstraction, and they therefore have the capacity to combine concepts in ways that do not have any present existential status. We have an abstract capacity, therefore we can take concepts separately arrived at from experience and project by the use of our imagination new combinations of observed characteristics. And we can do this because we have a conceptual ability. Ultimately, of course, all of our terms acquire meaning because of their reference to reality. The simple case of the centaur, which is half man and half horse, the constituents of that concept come from direct observation. But, and in this sense, all terms mean ultimately their observed reference. But if you grant that human beings have the power of abstraction, it does not there's no reason why we can't take terms formed this way and combine them in ways which represent groupings of characteristics that have no existential status. And so if you grant that human beings have a conceptual faculty, there's no such problem here. Underlying this alleged problem is the real nominalist positivist mentality, that all we can do is name sense data that go by, that we don't have a power of abstraction. And of course, if so, then when you make a statement about a unicorn or a round square, etc., nothing goes by to receive the name, and so you have the seeming problem of what are you referring to. All right, if that's the problem, what is Russell's solution to the problem? Well, his solution is that our ordinary language misled us. The grammatical structure of the propositions with definite descriptions is misleading. Now, what we have to do is learn to translate those propositions into other propositions which will get rid of the definite description, keep the same meaning as the original proposition, only without the definite description and therefore without any apparent reference to non-existence. And the classic example in which Russell elaborated this theory was on the statement, the author of Waverley was Scotch. The author of Waverley, that's a novel, was Scotch. And he's now going to embark on a process that's in ordinary language, you see, with the definite description being the author of Waverley. He's now going to embark on a process of translation in which he wants to keep the meaning of that original statement, but get rid of the phrase, the author of Waverley, and thus get rid of the suggestion that the author now exists in some Meinongian underworld, you see. Well, how are we going to translate it? What is the actual meaning of the author of Waverley was Scotch? Well, Russell argues approximately like this. It tells us that somebody wrote this novel, Waverley. If you said nobody wrote it, you would be denying this statement. So one thing, it tells us that somebody wrote it. And of course, it tells us only one person wrote it. If you said there were two authors, that would conflict with the initial statement. And of course, it also tells you that the author was Scotch, not French or German, etc. So, we can take the original statement, the author of Waverley was Scotch, and rewrite it as a summation of three statements. At least one person wrote Waverley. At most one person wrote Waverley. Whoever wrote Waverley was Scotch. And that combination of those three statements is now the translation of the original statement, the author of Waverley was Scotch. And what have we accomplished? Well, the phrase, the author of Waverley, has now gone. The definite description does not appear, and therefore there's no suggestion that it refers to some presently existing individual, and therefore we have translated from this misleading ordinary language formulation into a preferable series of formulations solve the original problem. Now, this is Russell's theory of definite description, and this is actually put forth as a profound resolution of a philosophic problem and a profound philosophic analysis. Now, I cannot help observing just in passing that this is as fantastic as anything I personally have heard in the entire history of philosophy from Thales to the present. Claim is that the phrase, the author of Waverley, has disappeared. And of course that phrase has disappeared, but obviously the meaning of that phrase has not disappeared. The words have disappeared, but not their meaning. What does it mean to say, we're allowed to say one person wrote Waverley? But what does it mean to say one person wrote Waverley? If I wanted to make a philosophic problem where none exists, I could say, what does one person mean in that statement? Who does it refer to? Which one person? Well, you say the one person who wrote Waverley. In other words, the author of Waverley. If I say, whoever wrote Waverley was Scotch, what does it mean to say whoever wrote Waverley? Well, whoever was the author of Waverley. If you had the initial problem of what to do with the phrase the author of Waverley, which nobody had, except maybe Meinong, but if you had that initial problem, you'd have the same problem all over the place on this alleged resolution. But I've taken the 10 minutes to present you this theory because it's one of Russell's most famous, and it will communicate better than any simple arbitrary assertion on my part the utter senselessness of this type of analysis. Now I want to give you one more, at least, of Russell's theories, because from two concretes you can draw an abstraction. I'll turn to one more of his major contributions, and this is taken from Principia Mathematica. I take this at random, but this one is also famous. It's known as the theory of material implication. Material implication. Now let me sketch in the background of this one. To begin with, Russell, in these years, advocated an essentially Humean viewpoint. He called his metaphysics at this stage logical atomism. Logical atomism. This is an essentially Humean view of the world. It's the view that the world consists of a set of simple, irreducible facts, each one of them independent of all the rest. Each one of them entirely independent of all the rest. So that in this logical atomist universe, no fact necessitates any other. Wittgenstein, who subscribed in his early phase to essentially the same view, said, I quoted it last week, I don't have the exact words here, but the idea was any one fact could be obliterated and all the rest would go on untouched. In other words, we have a Humean universe in which necessity is banished entirely. There are no necessary connections in the real world. No fact implies any other. We have a completely independent heap of facts. Now, why did Russell call this logical atomism? Well, because he was looking for the basis of human knowledge, the most fundamental type of statement that we could utter. And his reasoning was something like this: if you just plunge in and take any complex statement that a human being makes, for instance, France declared war, that is obviously not a primitive or irreducible statement, because that is really a shorthand way of making a whole bunch of statements about a whole bunch of individuals. France is not a super entity, so when you say France declared war, you're making a number of statements about what individual Frenchmen did. And of course, on a Humean viewpoint, a statement about individuals is not primitive or primary, because we don't directly grasp individuals, we only get a stream of sense data. And an individual is just a name for a whole series of sense data which are well behaved across time. So if we keep taking any statement and break it down to its more basic constituents and its most basic constituents, we'll finally end up with what Russell called the logical atoms of our knowledge. Simple, irreducible statements. The atoms, you see, of logical analysis. And what are they? They are statements describing sense data. The ultimate atoms of our knowledge will be statements like, and I now point, this is green, or this is greener than that, etc. That is the basic type of statement, so-called atomic statement, because it states an ultimate, irreducible sense data. Either states that it has a certain quality or a certain relationship. And so if a meaningful statement is a statement which refers to facts, and these are the ultimate facts, these procession of sense data, then the ultimate statements must be atomic statements, statements describing these atomic facts. What about more complex statements? Like, suppose you had the temerity to say, this is green and that is red. Now, see, that wouldn't be an atomic statement. Can you guess what that's called? That's a molecular statement, right? And a molecular statement is one which depends entirely upon the truth of its atomic components. It's simply a shorthand way, in this case, the example I gave you, of asserting two atomic statements together, you see, so it's a little molecule. Now, according to Russell, all complex statements are to be interpreted this way. Any statement which goes beyond simply, this is red, this is greener than that, etc. Any statement which goes beyond direct description of sensory data is simply a shorthand summary of these independent atomic statements. Now, against this background, you can get, I think, his theory of what's called material implication. It arises in the Principia when he's concerned to define the relationship of implication. We say one statement implies another, and that's usually put P implies Q, where P is any one statement and Q is any other. I say, for instance, Socrates is a man implies that Socrates is mortal, or Fido is a dog implies that Fido can't do calculus. Now the question is, how should we interpret statements of the order P implies Q? How do we interpret those? Well, we know that those must be simply shorthand ways of summarizing atomic sense data. We know that there is no necessity in the world, and so we're going to have to give a very unusual interpretation to such a statement as P implies Q. And Principia Mathematica gives us the answer. How a statement like this is simply a summary of statements about sense data. Now, traditionally, I point out, philosophers had held that when you say P implies Q, you're saying that if P is the case, then Q must be the case. In other words, that P necessitates Q. That given the first, you must have the second. And I point out to you that as a consequence of this traditional view, philosophers held that whenever P does imply Q, you will never have a situation in which P is true and Q is false. And of course that would follow from the fact that P necessitates Q. You would never have a situation in which P is true and Q is false, because of course the first necessitates the second. Well, now what does Russell do? All statements are ultimately atomic, are reducible to atomic statements. So P implies Q has got to be interpreted as simply a cluster of atomic statements. And there is no necessity connecting facts. We're going to have a logic without any necessity. Well, what does he do? He simply plunges in, takes the consequence of the traditional definition, and makes that the definition. And it comes out as follows. For Russell, P implies Q simply means the following. It is not, in fact, the case that P is true and Q is false. P implies Q simply states it is not, in fact, the case that P is true and Q is false. This is what's called material implication. A proposition P is said to materially imply a proposition Q whenever it is not the case that P is true and Q is false. We no longer, when we say P implies Q, assert any necessary connection between the two at all. We merely confine ourselves to uttering two independent atomic statements, P and Q, and say, oh look, it's not the case that the first is true and the second is false. And that's all we mean when we say P implies Q. And whenever we find that it's not the case that the first is true and the second is false, we're entitled to say the first implies the second on this definition. So, for instance, on this definition of implication, any true statement implies any true statement, because the definition of implies is it's not the case that the first is true and the second is false. So, for instance, 2 and 2 is 4 implies snow is white. Any false statement implies any false statement, because it's not the case that the first is true and the second is false. So, for instance, if I say 2 and 2 is 9, that implies that the Battle of Waterloo was fought in the Adirondacks. Both are false. That's the definition. Any false statement implies any true statement, because it's not the case that the first is true and the second is false. So, for instance, Bertrand Russell, the greatest philosopher in history, implies that 2 and 2 is 4. The only time you can't say implies is when the first is true and the second is false. And I'll permit myself a quote here from Professor Blanchard, who makes it as clear as we need to make it. Quote, "Perhaps the clearest way of conceiving it is as follows. Take two propositions at random, P and Q. Obviously, each of them may be either true or false, and thus 4 combinations are possible. Both may be true. That is the first possibility. Both may be false. That is the second. The third is that the first proposition may be false and the second true. The fourth is the opposite of this, namely that the first may be true while the second is false. Now, in the usage of the logicians who follow Russell, one proposition is said to imply another materially when any one of the first 3 possibilities holds. If 2 propositions are both true, then they imply each other, even though one of them is the proposition that snow is cold and the other the proposition that grass is green. If 2 propositions are both false, again they imply each other, regardless of what they assert. Darwin discovered gravitation implies that Benedict Arnold wrote Jerusalem Delivered. Finally, if the first proposition is false and the second true, once more the first implies the second. Darwin discovered gravitation implies that Roosevelt was re-elected in 1936. In sum, P always implies Q except when P is true and Q is false. Professor Blanchard goes on to comment, quote, "To say that this is what we mean when we say that the premises of a syllogism imply its conclusion, or when, in the language of common thought, we say that anything implies anything else, is merely grotesque. What an extraordinary performance to elaborate a system of logic from which all necessity is excluded," unquote. A comment which I can only echo fervently. I think you can see in what way this type of approach represents the destruction of logic. You get a taste here of the alternative logics, non-Aristotelian approaches to logic that the positivists and the pragmatists talk about and that we mentioned in preceding lectures. And you see, of course, that given sufficiently unrestrained exercise of your imaginative capacity, you can make up all sorts of different theories of what is implication and what is logical relationship and what is valid reasoning, because you don't have to be inhibited by any concern for reality. You simply specify how you're going to use certain terms and you set up your own system. Now, it should be obvious that the effect of this particular theory of Russell's is to simply destroy the use or point of logic. You cannot learn by deductive reasoning anymore. You cannot say A implies B. I know A is true, therefore I've learned that B is true. Because A implies B simply means it's not the case, in fact, that A is true and B is false. So you have to know the status of B one way or the other in order to know that A implies B. Logic, in other words, logical deduction becomes useless. Necessity is banished. We have a heap of so-called atomic facts simply strung together without comprehensibility or intelligibility, and that is Bertrand Russell's contribution essentially to logic. Now, let's conclude with a brief word of his views on ethics. He's quite explicit on this, and I'll let some quotes from him speak for his view on ethics. Quote, these are all from Russell. In a question as to whether this or that is the ultimate good, there is no evidence either way. Each disputant can only appeal to his own emotions and employ such rhetorical devices as shall rouse similar emotions in others. Unquote. Quote, there are no facts of ethics. Unquote. Quote, when we assert that this or that has value, we are giving expression to our own emotions, not to a fact which would still be true if our personal feelings were different. Unquote. Quote, since no way can even be imagined for deciding a difference as to values, the conclusion is forced upon us that the difference is one of tastes, not one as to any objective truth. Unquote. Now that is all perfectly clear. That is a rampant ethical subjectivism and is all over Russell's writings. Now I may say that Russell has been accused of inconsistency on this point because he says emphatically that ethics is entirely subjective. It has no binding efficacy on others, whatever conclusions you come to. Yet he constantly comes out with some new book, tract, speech, lecture, or essay which takes some violent ethical stand. He takes some vehement ethical position. And how does he reconcile his taking of ethical positions with his fervent ethical subjectivism? Quote from Russell, I'll let this answer speak for itself. Quote, I am accused of inconsistency, perhaps justly, because although I hold ultimate ethical valuations to be subjective, I nevertheless allow myself emphatic opinions on ethical questions. If there is an inconsistency, it is one that I cannot get rid of without insincerity. Moreover, an inconsistent system may well contain less falsehood than a consistent one. I am not prepared to forego my right to feel and express ethical passions. No amount of logic, even though it be my own, will persuade me that I ought to do so. Unquote. You have now had a taste of Bertrand Russell. We'll take our break here. Now let us continue our discussion of the analyst movement in philosophy, having looked at some of its precursors. And I want to now turn for the remainder of this evening to the type of analyst who is known as an ordinary language analyst. An ordinary language analyst. This movement is sometimes called ordinary language analysis, sometimes simply called linguistic analysis. It goes under a variety of names. It's sometimes called philosophical analysis, logical analysis, Oxford analysis, from the place where it had its birth, and so on. It's far and away the most dominant type of philosophic approach in Britain today. It's almost completely taken over British philosophy, and it is very big in the United States among professional philosophers. It is the sophisticated thing to be. Ordinary language analysis came to prominence in part owing to Moore, in part owing to Russell, although neither of them are typical ordinary language analysts. But the most influential figure who generated this movement is Wittgenstein. And here I refer to the later Wittgenstein. You remember we made a distinction some weeks ago between what's sometimes called Wittgenstein I and Wittgenstein II. The early Wittgenstein of the Tractatus was very influential on the logical positivists. Well, the Wittgenstein in his later phase, I may say his dates are 1889 to 1951. In 1953 there was published posthumously a work by him entitled Philosophic Investigations, which was the real impetus to the development of the ordinary language movement. You may have heard of some of the following names. I'll just mention rapidly some of the figures in this movement: Wisdom, Ryle, Austin, Hampshire, Noel Smith, Toulmin, Strawson, Malcolm, Anscombe, Flew. I see no looks of recognition. None of these people are known outside the circle of professional philosophers, and you'll see why shortly. Now, my procedure in discussing this type of approach is to begin with some of the later Wittgenstein's views on the nature of language, and then, in consequence, to some of his views on the nature and purpose of philosophy, and then conclude with a few examples of the application of this approach to philosophy to specific questions. Well, to begin, in his earlier period, the Wittgenstein of the Tractatus subscribed to a variant of logical atomism that we just mentioned. He held essentially in this early period that the world consists of a procession of sense data, these irreducible atoms of knowledge, so-called atomic facts, that each of them is independent of all the others, and that if we're to use language meaningfully, all we can do is describe these atomic sense data. That any compound or complex statement is really only a way of uttering a number of atomic facts at the same time. And he held that if we were to be really clear when we spoke, we can achieve such clarity only if we reconstruct ordinary language in order to make clear that all we are ever really allowed to do is describe atomic facts. From this viewpoint, he thought that ordinary language was unsatisfactory, that it was filled with vagueness, unclarity, misleading. It sounds as though if we use ordinary language, we can talk about things which aren't simply statements about atomic facts. We use terms like mind, reality, existence, which don't appear to name sense data. Hence, from this early point of view, he thought ordinary language misleads us, and he sympathized with the ideal language people. We would construct, according to this view, a vocabulary, all of whose constituents refer to sense data, and we will specify the rules for reducing all complex assertions back down to statements about atomic facts. This was, in essence, Russell's approach. This was the positivist approach, and when he was younger, it was Wittgenstein's approach also. However, he became disenchanted with this approach for a number of reasons, but the central one was that he discovered that there is just too much that people say in ordinary language that we all understand and it's perfectly meaningful, but that does not fit into this particular ideal language logical atomist scheme. With the result that if you subscribe to the logical atomist viewpoint, whole hosts of utterances have to be written off as meaningless. For instance, the logical atomists had great trouble with universal or general propositions. For instance, all men are mortal, because that has to be simply a summary of atomic facts, ultimately a summary of sense data descriptions. And of course, you could never offer such a translation. You would die before you enumerated separately all the sense data that are involved in the statement, all men are mortal, because there's an endless number of men. And so some of them held that general statements of that sort must be meaningless because they couldn't be translated back down into atomic statements. Moral statements, to take another category, we have no moral sense data going by, and consequently it seemed that moral propositions had to be meaningless, and metaphysical propositions for the same reason. Even the premises of the theory itself were unstatable, given the theory. For instance, the statement, all ultimate facts are atomic, or all meaningful statements describe atomic facts. These statements don't describe sense data, and consequently they must be nonsense by the very theory itself. Now, you remember Wittgenstein at one point said that while it's true that it was nonsense, it was important nonsense. But later he came to feel that this was too paradoxical a viewpoint. And so he developed a different view. Now let me interject here. Where, in fact, is the fallacy in the logical atomist ideal language viewpoint? And of course the answer is in their incredible nominalism and sensualism. Error lies in their view that human beings have no distinctive conceptual capacity, that all we can do is glare uncomprehendingly at streams of passing sense data and tag or label them. That concepts are just shorthand names for clusters of sense data. If you wanted to attack the Russell type of logical atomism, this is what you had to attack, namely the nominalist sensualist axis, if you were to unmask the fallacy in that approach. We can put it this way. The logical atomists held two different tenets about the nature of language. One tenet was that language must be used to state or describe facts. And the second is that the only cognitive equipment that we have to learn about facts and enable us to refer to them is sensations. And of course the fallacy is in this, I speak for myself now, the fallacy is in this second proposition. It's not, of course, in the first. You would recognize, I think, that it's obvious that language is a code of symbols whose meaning comes from their reference to reality. That's the very difference between a word and simply a noise. If I just utter ta-ta-ta-ta, that's a noise. It stands for nothing. It has no referent in reality, no relation to facts. It's therefore meaningless. So we could say logical atomism was correct in saying that language must be used to state facts, but it broke down because it deprived man of his distinctive means of knowing facts. Now, why do I emphasize this? Because Wittgenstein took exactly the opposite course. His solution to the problems generated by logical atomism, his explanation of why the ideal language view went wrong was it was based on the assumption that language was for the purpose of stating or describing facts. It was based on the assumption that language was for the purpose of describing reality, of referring to reality. And he decided this was the basic error. In other words, confronted with a theory that went bad, and the theory had two constituents. Language must be used to state facts, and our only means of knowing facts is by sensualist means. Wittgenstein proceeded to deny the first of these two. Language, he said, is not primarily a tool for referring to or describing reality at all. And this is his central contribution to the theory of language. Language is not primarily a tool for describing reality or for stating facts. Sometimes, says Wittgenstein, we do use language this way, but only sometimes. And description of reality is not at all the only function of language, nor is it by any means the most important function of language. We have to downgrade the emphasis on the tie between language and reality. We can do, says Wittgenstein and his followers, all sorts of things with language besides describe or state facts. Well, you ask, what can it do? Well, what can we do? Well, for instance, we can ask questions. We say, is the sky blue? That isn't stating a fact on the face of it. That isn't a description, so it seems. That's a different use of language, a non-fact stating use of language. Or I can give commands. For instance, I can say, shut the window. Now there again, the Wittgensteinians would say, I'm using language, but I'm not using it to state a fact or to describe anything about reality. That's a different function of language. That's, let us say, the commanding or imperative function of language. And of course, I can use language in the optative to express a fervent desire. I say, would that he were here. You see, Another use of language which is not descriptive of anything, so they say, it doesn't state any facts. That's, let us say, the fervent wish use of language. Or I can wave to someone and say, bye-bye, and I'm using language, but I'm not describing anything. So you get from these people whole lists of what you can do with language. And here, for instance, from Wittgenstein, quote, how many kinds of sentence are there? There are countless different kinds of use of what we call symbols, words, sentences, and this multiplicity is not something fixed, unquote. And then this commentator, Warnock, one advocate of this school, goes on to give you the types of usages that words have. Words are used, I'm quoting now, words are used in giving orders, describing things, expressing wishes, in play acting, translating, telling stories, in asking, thanking, cursing, greeting, praying, etc., unquote. As one commentator pointed out when he read one of these lists, they left out reading aloud to send an old man to sleep as one of the usages of language. But in any event, the point of it is that we must not be dominated by one model of language, namely the model according to which language is essentially a descriptive or fact-stating instrument. Wittgenstein claimed that when he was young he had that view, but now as he developed, his eyes are opened and he sees the limitless types of things that you can do with language. Well, now you may ask me, if description of reality, statement of fact is not essential to language, what is? You may say you always thought that language was a code of symbols to designate, to refer to existence, but if that view is now out, what then is language? And you may ask the question, what's common to all the usages of language that I mentioned, in virtue of which we call them all language? What makes language language on this view? What's the essence of language? Wittgenstein's answer to that question is, there is nothing at all common to all the usages of language, in virtue of which we call them all language. Quote from Wittgenstein, instead of producing something common to all that we call language, I am saying that these phenomena have no one thing in common which makes us use the same word for all, unquote. In other words, there's no one common denominator uniting all usages of language on the basis of which it is language. If you try to find such a common denominator, you will be chastised by advocates of this viewpoint for being what they sometimes call reductionistic. In other words, you will be dominated by one model of what language is. For instance, that language is a tool for stating facts, and you'll try to explain all other types of language as simply that on the basis of that one model. Now, we mustn't do this according to the Wittgensteinians. We mustn't take any one model as essential for the use of language. That, they think, was the fallacy of the logical atomists, who got stuck on the descriptive model of language, and you see the problems that generated, they say. Well, if you ask, why do we then apply the same name to them all, if they have all the different usages of language, if they have nothing in common? I remind you in answer of the example from Wittgenstein that we introduced on the opening night lecture of this course. Remember, we took the example of game, and Wittgenstein's view that there was no one common denominator uniting everything that we call a game, putting them all together into one class. There was no such set of characteristics possessed by everything we call a game. Remember, games were united only by vague, what Wittgenstein called family resemblances. They were more or less like each other. There were certain overlapping resemblances between certain sets of things that we have games, But reality did not, I'm just reminding you now at this point, reality did not dictate that we classify things as we do, that we put together in the group called game the things that we do. Our usage determines that. We decide we're going to call game the following things and not call game other things. We do that on the basis of vague resemblances, but we determine the usage and group arbitrarily on the basis of our convenience. Reality doesn't. Well, if that was the basic nominalist position. Well, if you understood that on the concept of game, what Wittgenstein does is now apply that simply to the concept of language. There is nothing common to all the usages that we call language. They're simply related by vague family resemblances. We call it language and draw the line as we wish. So, we can't say the essence of language is so-and-so, the essence of language is so-and-so. What can we say positively about language? We can't say it's a set of symbols for referring to reality. The best way to think of it for the Wittgensteinians is language is like a box of tools, or a box of instruments for getting various jobs done in life. And there's all sorts of tools in the box, because there's all sorts of different jobs and usages. There is no one fundamental archetypical job, you see. There's no one preeminent job. There's the job, for instance, of taking leave of someone. And one of the tools we have in the linguistic box to perform this job is goodbye. That's one of our linguistic tools, and it has a job to perform. Or there's the job of prescribing or urging or exhorting people to do something, which is different, they say, from describing. This is prescribing or urging. And, for instance, the linguistic utterance, "this is good," does that particular job. So we've got a whole variety of different linguistic tools, each with their own job in ordinary usage. These tools have developed as people live their lives. They are, says Wittgenstein, quote, forms of life. And we are to, therefore, study them and evaluate them by reference to the job they perform and the way people actually use them. So long as a linguistic tool has some use in ordinary living, then it's perfectly all right. Now notice, therefore, it is not the case that it's facts of reality which determine or validate the structure and usage of language, because language is no longer regarded as inherently fact-stating instrument. It's people and their purposes that decide if a given linguistic usage is valid or not. If that usage is valid if people have given it a use, if they've given it a job to do. So language is now severed from reality. We have, you can perhaps think of it more clearly this way, if you think of it as paralleling the pragmatist position, because this is really pragmatism applied to the theory of language. What the pragmatists did to truth, Wittgenstein did to language. The pragmatist said truth is not a matter of an idea's relationship to reality. Truth is an issue of an idea's subservience to human purposes. They said an idea, remember, is not an identification of facts, but an instrument or a tool for solving human problems. Well, Wittgenstein does essentially that now to the idea of language. Language is not a code of symbols for referring to reality, but a set of loosely related tools that human beings have developed to achieve their purposes, but it has no inherent connection to reality, so we have the same severing from reality on the level of language that the pragmatists did on the level of truth. Now, if you've grasped this much, you should see, once you've cut the tie between language and reality, then, of course, the rules and structure of language become fundamentally arbitrary. No longer is it the case that the structure and rules of language are dictated by reality or are to be validated by reference to reality. It's now people and their usages, which is the primary, which determines whether language is being used properly, not reality. And since people and don't get their usages and purposes from reality on this view, that means ultimately at the base of language is certain arbitrary desires on the part of people. You can think of it this way, and this is how the advocates of this view avowedly present it. Using language, any type of language now, using language is like playing a game. It's like playing a game. There are some rules to any game that you play, but those rules are arbitrary. They're not dictated by reality. The people who made up the game make up the rules. Now take chess, for instance, which is very often taken by members of this school. They say, suppose you're setting up chess for the first time. And you're going to consider the question, should the king move 1 square or 2 squares? Should it have the ability to move 1 square or 2 squares or 3 squares or what? Well, there's no way you can get an answer to that question from reality. Reality doesn't tell you how the king should move, or the bishop should move, or the rook should move, and so on. It's a game. And it's a game you make up whatever rules you want. Once the rules are made up, then if you want to play that game, you have to obey those rules. If you don't want to play, of course, nobody forces you to play that game. You can make up your own game and play your own game instead. But the key point here is you can't say of the rules of chess they're right or wrong, true or false. All you can say is you will play the game or you won't play the game. There's no compulsion, in other words. I'm presenting this to you now. There's no compulsion to the adoption of one set of rules over another. Well, now for the Wittgensteinians, the same is true of all usages of language. Language, too, is a game. In fact, many games. And Wittgenstein, to stress this point, refers normally not to language, but to what he calls language games. There's the language game of ethics, in which we play according to certain rules. There's the language game of praying, and so on. And there's an endless number of language games that we play. Now, all these games have certain rules, which are ultimately arbitrary. And that, of course, includes the language game of mathematics and logic. There is no compulsion about playing the game, but if you play it by the rules that have been laid down. A quote now from a commentator. Quote, each complex of linguistic activities is taken by itself and treated in effect as a virtually self-contained system. Within the game, moves may be challenged and standards referred to, but the game as a whole has merely to be accepted. Unquote. And one more quote. For Wittgenstein, there is no compulsion about the use of words. We suppose that their existing use obliges us to apply them in such ways in other contexts. We think that the meaning itself demands it, but we may use them as we like. Unquote. You can use words as you like. Now, you may still have a hangover from old-fashioned philosophy. You may say, but you have some sense of compulsion about the use of language. If somebody says to you, you may ask me, if somebody says to you, how much is 2 and 2? Isn't there a compulsion on you to answer 4? Well, I'll let this commentator speak on that. Quote, the sense of compulsion is illusory. That is the first thing we must notice. One who has written 2 and 2 is, failing the compulsion of the teacher's cane, in no way compelled to write 4. He may write down whatever figure he pleases, or make arbitrary marks, or none at all. Now, you interject here, well, but he isn't adding if he writes down nothing at all. And the commentator goes on, but so long as he is adding, it may be said, he must write 4. And that is true. For otherwise we shall not call it adding. In other words, one of the rules of the game we play is that if you don't write down 4 after somebody has written down 2 and 2, we won't call that adding. That's the adding language game. And if you don't want to play it, you don't have to. The commentator goes on, quote, we have seen that if we are to play chess, to do what is now called playing chess, we must follow certain rules. But we are not therefore obliged to play chess or to invent games with this set of rules rather than that, unquote. Now here you see conventionalism, but with a vengeance. In principle now applied across the board. Language as such is arbitrary and detached from reality. Well, if you grasp this view to this point, you will see that there can no longer be such an idea as an ideal language. You can no longer talk about an ideal language, because the ideal language was supposed to be the language which conformed to and expressed the nature of facts. But now language is severed from facts. Therefore, there is no longer any basis on which to criticize ordinary language. Once you sever language from reality, you can't point to any facts to say this use of language is incorrect. There's no grounds to criticize ordinary usage. Ordinary language, in other words, is in principle exempt from criticism on this view. That is the primary. People speak in certain ways. That is where we start as philosophers. They play certain linguistic games, and that is the given that determines where we go from there. Consequently, we no longer talk on this interpretation of an ideal language, but simply of ordinary language. Ordinary language is ordinary people employ. And thus you see the name of this school, Ordinary Language Analysis. The essence of the idea is ordinary language replaces reality as the primary, as the fundamental philosophic criterion. If in the old days the idea was adherence to reality is the criterion of correctness in the use of language, in this version it now comes out the criterion of correctness in the use of language is adherence to ordinary language. We turn now to the question of what is their ordinary language analyst's view of the nature and function of philosophy. At the outset, I remind you of the positivist view that philosophy is an activity, that it has no distinctive subject matter, no specific domain of questions which is its distinctive province. Now, this viewpoint is essential to the later ordinary language analysts also. Facts, they hold, are within the domain of the empirical sciences. Facts are excluded from the domain of philosophy. It's therefore not the goal of philosophy to describe reality. Well, you might say, properly speaking, according to this view, there should be no philosophy at all, because facts are studied by science, and even language usage is factual. The way people speak is a fact, so shouldn't that be studied by linguists and lexicographers? So you may ask, well, what is there distinctive for the philosopher to do? Now, in essence, these people answer as follows. They say, it might be true in a perfectly rational world that there would be nothing whatever for philosophers to do, and that we'd simply wipe out the subject. But the fact is that a lot of people in the past have thought that there was something for philosophers to do. And the result is, these traditional philosophers have propounded all sorts of puzzles and paradoxes, and cluttered up the intellectual scene. What is our job as philosophers today, then? Well, to show that all of this was unnecessary, that it was brought about by confusion. We'll wipe out all these past errors, and that will put an end to philosophy. In other words, philosophy in the old days had its birth in confusion, and it's going to have its death in us putting an end to that confusion. Well, what sort of confusion generated philosophy? Well, you should have guessed by now. The Traditional old-fashioned philosophers were misled because they did not understand the use of ordinary language. The traditional philosopher didn't understand ordinary methods of speaking. He didn't understand the rules of the linguistic games that people were playing. And the result is he was led into a series of incredible confusions, constructs, and theories which have their genesis in his inability to grasp simple, ordinary language. I'll give you a couple of examples, and these are seriously put forth as the explanation for the development of traditional philosophy. People say, for instance, punctuality is a virtue. And they also say Jack is a carpenter. Now, the ordinary man on the street has no trouble. He understands what he means, and he lives his life perfectly happy. But the old-fashioned philosopher is the one who comes on the scene, and he reasons like this. Well, we say Jack is a carpenter. Well, in order to have the predicate carpenter, Jack has to actually exist. So if we say punctuality is a virtue, and if that's the same type of statement, in order to have the predicate virtue apply to something, there must be a punctuality as such somewhere. But I don't see it here, so it must be in a Platonic world of universes. And I've heard that seriously, that type of example, offered as the explanation for Plato. He misunderstood the rules governing ordinary usage. And because the sentence, punctuality is a virtue, was grammatically similar to Jack as a carpenter, he simple-mindedly, obtusely, the old-fashioned philosopher, took them as though they're exactly the same type of statement and postulated a world which has punctuality in it because on the other level the statement needed Jack. Or here's another example I've heard. You look down the road and somebody asks you what you see, and you say, I see somebody. And the next day you look down the same road, somebody asks what you see, you say, I see nobody. Now, the man on the street doesn't have any problems with this, but the philosopher, the old-fashioned philosopher, comes in and says, well, there must be two kinds of people. Somebody and nobody. Because he just said you saw nobody. See? And when you see somebody, there's something there. So when you see nobody, it must mean there's something there. Now, the old-fashioned philosopher didn't realize the game we played when we say, I see nobody. He didn't realize that this ordinary usage was simply a way of denying that we see somebody. He was very obtuse, you see. He took it at its face value as resembling the I see somebody statement, and then he has a puzzle. He says, how can you see nobody? Well, maybe we have special metaphysical eyes for detecting non-existence or whichever, you see. That is the kind of examples offered of the sort of linguistic confusion which allegedly gave rise to Plato, Aristotle, Kant, etc. In other words, to generalize on this view, the source of philosophy is someone who doesn't understand the rules and usages of ordinary language. And the result is a person who is perplexed, who is beset by puzzles. Wittgenstein says at one point, who experiences mental cramps. See, he thinks to himself, there must be nobody, but there can't be nobody. See, he's got a cramp. Well, says Wittgenstein, what we have to do is free these traditional philosophers from their mental cramps by simply pointing out the linguistic errors that they're making. We describe to him the games we play, the workings of our language. We break his mental confusion. We don't solve his problem, we dissolve it, is another way they put it. And at the end, he's happy. Says Wittgenstein, quote, philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language, unquote. He says he again, quote, all philosophy is critique of language, unquote. Now, I stress this. The purpose of philosophy is not to solve distinctive and genuine problems, but to dispel them. As these people put it, not to solve questions, but to dissolve, to get rid of perplexity and puzzlement. traditional philosophers were sick, you can think of it that way. Traditional philosophy was an illness. And the new philosophy, the ordinary language analyst type of philosophy, is a therapy which will correct this illness, which will cure it. Says Wittgenstein, quote, "When we do philosophy, we are like savages, primitive people who hear the expressions of civilized men, put a false interpretation on them, and then draw queer conclusions from it," unquote. And another quote from Wittgenstein. These are short because he wrote aphoristically. He had no connected case to put forth. Quote, "What is your aim in philosophy? To show the fly the way out of the fly bottle," unquote. The fly is the traditional philosopher who's got baffled by some philosophic question on the order of the somebody-nobody one because he misunderstood the use of language, so he's buzzing around in that bottle beset by mental cramps, and Wittgenstein's going to pull the cork, and he's going to fly out, no longer be perplexed. And some followers of the analyst movement compare it to psychoanalysis. They say just as the psychoanalyst allegedly cures psychological troubles by getting the patient to see how they were generated as he grew up, well, similarly, the philosophic analyst cures philosophic puzzles by showing how they arise through linguistic misunderstanding. And the difference between the two is, in effect, that the psychologist points out that you misunderstood your mother, and the philosopher points out that you misunderstood how she spoke. At the end of the process, completely clear. You don't have mental cramps anymore. Flies aren't buzzing in the bottle anymore. We know all the linguistic games we play. We know how people use words. We're sensitive to all the nuances of ordinary usage. That is the end of philosophy. Close up shop. If we're completely clear, that would mean the complete elimination of philosophy. Now I'll give you a very simplified example of how this would work, and then a couple of real examples. Suppose I point to this object, which in fact is red. It's red. And I now give you some incredible complex argument to show that it really isn't red, it's green, let us say. Now, a typical analyst would come in and say, this is not a subject for argument. This is not even a subject for discussion. You're making a linguistic error. This, in English, in ordinary usage, is called red. Period. Now, I can, if I want, engage in linguistic therapy and ask what could have possessed you to depart from our ordinary language game and call it by a different name. But that's as far as I go. I simply say this is its ordinary usage. Well, all philosophic issues are in essence like this. What the true philosopher does is simply describe ordinary language and show how the old philosopher misused it. We never criticize ordinary language. We don't reform it. We don't explain it. We don't justify it. It is the irreducible, the metaphysical primary, so to speak. We merely describe it and point out that such and such a theory violates ordinary usage. And then presumably a man's mental cramps go away and he's okay. Says Wittgenstein, quote, "Philosophy may in no way interfere with the actual use of language. It can in the end only describe it. For it cannot give it any foundation either. It leaves everything as it is," unquote. And says Wittgenstein again, quote, "What we do is to bring words back from their metaphysical to their everyday usage," unquote. And says another member of this school, Dr. MacDonald, quote, "Philosophical questions are not factual, but verbal. Philosophic problems can be solved by understanding how language is ordinarily used, how certain uses of it have provoked these problems, and how it has been misused in many alleged solutions," unquote. Now let me give you a couple of examples so you get some idea of how this approach would be applied. We're going to now dissolve issues, not solve them, but dissolve them by appealing to ordinary language. And I'll give you a couple of somewhat simplified examples, but it'll certainly make clear, I think, the essence of this approach for our purposes. Well, take, for instance, the problem of induction. The problem of induction was, of course, how can we ever justify inducing? How can we ever justify generalizing from the past to make predictions about the future? Why is it rational to engage in induction? Now, prior to Hume, it had been held that it was rational because there was a law of cause and effect, according to which everything that happens in reality happens according to necessary law, and therefore, given the appropriate methodology, we can easily justify generalizing from the past to prediction about the future, and we can justify that because we know reality is inherently lawful. But that is a metaphysical justification of induction by reference to the basic nature of reality, and that is, of course, not at all an analyst type of justification. They come at the question from the point of view of ordinary language. And their solution to the problem of induction, their dissolution of the problem, is as follows. They say, well, you're asking me the question, why is it rational to engage in deduction? Why is it reasonable to induce? And the analysts come back and say, well, look, that's part of what it means to be reasonable as the term is used in ordinary language. If you met a man who didn't induce, who never drew general conclusions from his past experience, you wouldn't call him rational in ordinary language. Consequently, there's no such question as, is it rational to engage in induction? Because engaging in induction is part of what we mean by rational. That's the language game we play with the word rational. We use the word rational in such a way, that's the way people use it, that if you don't induce, you're not called rational. So there's no problem. Now observe here, there's no question asked as to why is the word rational used this way. What's the justification for using it? There's a complete oblivion to the fact that people call induction rational because they believe there's a basis in reality for induction, namely the law of cause and effect. If you take away that basis, as the analysts do, then of course people would stop calling induction rational, just as Hume stopped calling it rational. So what the analyst does is, he comes onto the scene. He agrees with Hume in destroying the basis for induction. And then he appeals to ordinary usage to claim that it's nevertheless still rational, having himself just obliterated the basis for that ordinary usage. He makes no attempt to show that it's justified to call it rational. He simply takes ordinary usage as the primary. And on that criteria, induction emerges as rational, because people arbitrarily use the word rational that way. I'll give you one more example on the problem of free will. Now, these analysts do not all apply their method the same way and don't come up with the same conclusions, but this is a kind of representative one. Now, you know that the free will versus determinism question is a complex question in philosophy. Determinists have given many complex arguments for their view. And if you want to answer them, you know that there's a lot involved. You have to define a concept of causality, which makes clear how you can reconcile causality with free choice, and then you have to give proof that free choice actually exists, and so on. It's a complex issue. But the ordinary language analyst does not have to go into this whole complexity of philosophic analysis and argumentation. He says to himself, does the phrase free will have a use in one of our language games? If so, And remember, in philosophy, we can't alter or criticize our language games, we simply play them. If it has a use, then there is free will. Well, I now give you what's sometimes called the argument from the smiling bridegroom. We look at a smiling bridegroom. He's marrying the girl of his choice. He's obviously happy. Man looks at him and says he's marrying her of his own free will. And that is obvious, ordinary usage. That's not any violation of ordinary language. If someone says he's marrying her of his own free will, that's perfectly ordinary usage. Well, free will has a usage, therefore there is free will. So much for determinism. Ordinary usage takes care of the question and comes down on the side of free will. Now, I think the objection to this approach is so obvious as perhaps to be unnecessary to state, but simply in a word. Clearly, when we use a term and apply it to something, we do so because we think that the thing has the characteristics of the definition of the term. But we're not infallible. We might be wrong. Consequently, if we apply a term, we have to prove that we're right to apply it. The sheer fact that we use a term in ordinary life does not prove anything whatever about the facts. And the determinist in the case I just cited could come back and say, well, maybe people do use the words free will, but they shouldn't. I've just given an argument as to why there's no such thing, and this is a mistake. So the determinist would say, shouldn't philosophy alter incorrect usage, you see? Would therefore dismiss this as an entirely worthless argument. But of course, any such objection presupposes that language is based on existence. It presupposes that there's existence and that language is a code of symbols to describe it. But on this approach, language comes first. It's the uncriticizable primary, and it generates truth. Well, you get an idea, I think, just from this brief touch of how do analysts go about dissolving philosophic questions. At the end, when we finished it all, as I say, we have no philosophic system. We have no metaphysics. Philosophy is altogether detached from life. And I think I'll let one of the advocates describe this view of what the function of philosophy is. Quote, this is also from Warnock in a book called English Philosophy Since 1900. Quote, it is at any rate certain that questions of belief, questions of a religious, moral, political, or generally cosmic variety are seldom, if at all, directly dealt with in contemporary philosophy. Why is this so? The first part of an answer to this question can easily be given. There is a very large number of questions, not of that variety which philosophers find themselves to be more interested in discussing. But many would go further. They would wish to say that philosophy has nothing to do with questions of that kind. Questions of that kind include religious, moral, political, or cosmic questions. And then he goes on to explain. Political philosophy involves the study of political concepts, but says nothing of the rights or wrongs of political issues. The moral philosopher examines the language of morals, but does not as such express moral judgments. The philosopher of religion may be, but by no means need be, a religious believer. Contemporary philosophers would say more generally that philosophy is the study of the concepts that we employ and not of the facts, phenomena, cases, or events to which those concepts might be or are employed. Do you get that? Philosophy is the study of the concepts that we employ and not of the facts, phenomena, cases, or events to which those concepts might be or are applied. To investigate the latter is to raise political or moral or religious, but not philosophical problems or questions. In other words, there are two realms. There's the realm of facts and the realm of linguistic usage. And philosophy simply studies the realm of linguistic usage, cut off altogether from the realm of facts. So it's like a version of Platonism, only the stand-in for Plato's world of universals is now the world of linguistic usages, which philosophers study and describe in their own little self-contained way, completely cut off from the outside world. Philosophy, they say, is a neutral subject. It does not tell you what the world is like, how to acquire knowledge, how to live. It is, in short and in a word, this movement represents the complete self-confessed abdication of philosophy. Now, I want to conclude by saying a few words about their characteristic approach to ethical questions. I won't belabor this point, but just to give you an indication, how do the ordinary language analysts approach the questions of ethics? Now, traditional philosophers had held that ethical terms, that is like good, evil, right, wrong, and so on, value terms, refer to or designate something in reality. And that ethical statements say something about the world and that they're either true or false. That was the traditional view. Now the contemporary analysts abandon this view completely. They hold that ethical terms do not refer to or designate any entities, acts, relations, anything in reality. That ethical statements do not get their meaning from what they designate or stand for at all. That ethical statements say nothing whatever about the world, that they don't state facts, they're neither true nor false. They're neither in accord with nor violating facts. And if you recall the Wittgensteinian view that language is not essentially or primarily a fact-stating instrument, that it has no essential tie to reality, well, that's the line they take in ethics. They're going to take value judgments and explain them as non-fact stating forms of language. And therefore, in the case of value judgments, the question of true or false will just simply not come up. Ethics will be removed altogether from the province of cognition. And thus, the view of these people is sometimes called non-cognitivism, from the idea that ethics says nothing one way or the other about facts. It's neither true nor false. It's outside the province of cognition. After all, said Wittgenstein, many types of language have a use even if they refer to or state nothing about facts. Well, now, what sort of use or job does ethical language have, according to these people? Notice we've given up the attempt now to formulate ethical statements or to validate them. Ethics is now linguistic analysis, merely to state what jobs do various ethical utterances perform. Well, what jobs do they perform? Well, the most famous answer to this question is a theory known as the emotive theory of ethics. The emotive theory of ethics. And according to this theory, the function of ethical language is simply to express people's feelings and evoke corresponding feelings in other people. I say, for instance, such and such is bad. Now, according to the analysts, if I say, for instance, murder is bad, according to the emotivists, those who subscribe to this version, if I say murder is bad, I'm not saying anything about facts. I'm just expressing my feelings. That's a way of saying murder, just a way of evincing my emotion. And of course, my hope is also that if I say this to another person in the right tone of voice, that'll call up an equivalent emotion in him if he's been appropriately trained. So that ethics is a matter simply of emotional ejaculations. And I quote now from Ayer, who held this emotivist theory of ethics. He expresses it very clearly. Quote, "The presence of an ethical symbol in a proposition adds nothing to its factual content. Thus, if I say to someone, 'You acted wrongly in stealing that money,' I am not stating anything more than if I had simply said, 'You stole that money.'" Did you get that? In adding that this action is wrong, I am not making any further statement about it. I am simply evincing my moral disapproval of it. It is as if I had said, "You stole that money," in a peculiar tone of horror, or written it with the addition of some special exclamation marks. The tone or the exclamation marks adds nothing to the literal meaning of the sentence. It merely serves to show that the expression of it is attended by certain feelings in the speaker. Unquote. And this commentator goes on, what are called moral judgments are thus really exclamations. The judgment that a thing or a man is good or an action right is the expression of a warm or approving feeling about the object, and is roughly equivalent to cheers or good for you. The judgment that anything is bad or that an action is wrong is the expression of repulsion or abhorrence, and is roughly equivalent to boo or shame. This theory has therefore been christened the boo hooray theory of ethics. Now, on this emotivist theory, people have then got a set of non-rational, emotional attitudes, entirely independent of the facts of reality, and their ethical utterances simply express these attitudes. What happens if two people disagree on an ethical question? They actually disagree on an ethical question. Well, if they disagree on an ethical question, according to the school, there is no rational way to resolve the disagreement at all. Emotions are non-rational. They're not open to reason. Ethics has nothing to do with reason. What do we do to resolve disagreements in ethical attitude? Resort to any non-rational technique that will work. Use force, hypnosis, psychological pressure, work on the person's emotions. There's no point trying to argue for your ethical conclusion because ethics is removed entirely from the province of cognition. There's no hope to arrive at any objective conclusions, of course. Ethics doesn't state facts. This is the emotivist theory's contribution to sanity and peace in today's world. Now, there are still emotivists around, but the typical, and that approach to ethics is at the root of the ordinary language analyst's approach to ethics today. They all today characteristically deny that ethical utterances state facts, but they insist that they are not to be called emotivists. Now, the distinctions that they make between themselves and the emotivists are so minor and so petty as to be not worth discussing. It amounts to, for instance, that emotivists are sometimes criticized by later analysts on the grounds that they say ethical utterances have only one job to do, namely express emotions. But they find all sorts of non-cognitive jobs for them to do besides simply expressing emotions. And they make subtle distinctions between admonishing, warning, persuading, dissuading, encouraging, reproving, etc., all of which they regard as dissevered from reality and as not stating facts, but they think that the old-fashioned emotivists were too reductionistic. They thought there was just one non-rational thing for ethical utterances to do, and they found a whole spree of them. The view which is sometimes called multifunctionalist non-cognitivism, you see. But you don't have to take that down. Also, I may say the ordinary language analysts don't like the idea that you can't give good reasons for your view in ethics, because after all, in ordinary language, we can say you gave a good reason for your view, and they have to follow ordinary language. And so you get a series of incredible attempts on their part to combine the view that ethics has nothing to do with facts or reality and the view that you can give good reasons for your view. And one of these are weaker than the other. I wouldn't begin to even give you an indication, but if you want a patient step-by-step discussion, I refer you to a book by Professor Blanchard called Reason and Goodness, Chapter 9, in which he takes these later analysts' attempt to improve on the emotivist theory and shows that they get absolutely nowhere with it. Now, our time is running out. I want to conclude with just a couple of very brief critical comments on the whole analyst approach. And in essence, I simply want to deny for the record the whole view of language on which it's based. In other words, the view that language is not essentially fact-stating or based on or refer to reality. That view of Wittgenstein's, which underlies the whole ordinary language enterprise, is false. Now you can see why simply enough. The word is a symbol for a concept, which is a mental integration of two or more observed concretes. A word therefore has meaning only in terms of what it symbolizes, what it stands for, only in terms of a referent that it refers to. There's nothing you can do with words but designate or refer to facts of reality. That's inherent in the fact that words are symbols of concepts, and concepts are forms of integrating perceptual, existential concretes. If you take away the referent, if you take away reality, you have nothing to talk about, nothing to say. All you can do is grunt. Now this is true of all articulate utterance of any sort. Even if you ask a question, you are stating something about facts. You're saying you want a certain piece of information and would like the other person to give it to you. If you utter a command, you have still not cut off your tie to reality. Regardless of the grammatical form of your utterance, you're still saying there's something you want the other person to do. And this is true of any articulate utterance. If you utter a meaningful statement, it states a fact and refers to reality because there's nothing else to refer to or to talk about. This is equally true, of course, of ethical statements. I'll elaborate that point more when we get to the objectivist theory of ethics. In other words, on this point, I said there's only one job, to use that terminology, for statements to perform, and that is to state facts. Anybody who says that part of his discourse doesn't state facts is saying that to that extent his discourse is gibberish, and he should then stop speaking and not ask other people to listen. I have one last very brief criticism about the whole analyst movement. I divided it into the ideal language versus the ordinary language view. I've said some critical things about each as we go, but I want you to see that this whole alternative is a false alternative. The ideal language school begins by claiming that ordinary language is misleading and we need a new language. English isn't good enough. Why? Well, because the terms don't refer just to sense data, and the grammar is supposed to be misleading. Now, the fact that the terms don't refer just to sense data, to that I simply say thank goodness, because a sensualist language would be an impossibility. As far as the grammar of English being intrinsically misleading, this is simply false. A given individual may be misled by a grammar of a particular sentence, but a given person can be misled by anything. After all, human beings are fallible. There is no way of guaranteeing automatically that no one will ever misinterpret a statement. There's no way of guaranteeing that people will always speak and write clearly. There's nothing intrinsic in English or in any other developed language which requires misinterpretation. That's the key point, if you're in focus and careful and precise in the use of it. So the attempt to set up an ideal language is entirely pointless. There's no problem inherent in using English if you're in focus when you use it. And of course, if you try to set up an ideal language, it's a self-defeating attempt, as these people construe it. It's a self-defeating attempt anyway, because what language are they going to use while they're in process of setting up the ideal? They have to specify the grammar of the ideal language and give us the acceptable vocabulary and so on. Now, in what language are they speaking and writing while they're setting up the ideal one? Now, they can't use the ideal one yet because it doesn't exist, so they have to use the ordinary one. But the ordinary language then has to be used to conceive, define, and communicate the ideal one. Well, if the ordinary one is inherently vague, misleading, confusing, you simply inject all of that vagueness, confusion, and so on along into the allegedly ideal language. So So if English is unacceptable, and all natural languages, so-called, are unacceptable, you have to simply emulate Cratylus in the ancient world and say nothing at all. Now, is the alternative then that we should accept uncritically ordinary usage? No. And here I say you make a very simple distinction. You must distinguish the language, in this case English, along with its grammar and vocabulary on the one hand, distinguish the language from the definitions and the philosophical ideas which speakers of that language happen to hold. The fact that you use the language does not commit you to erroneous definitions, nor to erroneous philosophies. We're offered here an incredible false alternative. The alternative to denouncing English in general is not uncritical acceptance of the philosophy or definitions of the majority of speakers. The alternative to making up a new language is not to use the old language to say what everybody else says. The actual, real alternative is use English to say what is true. Use the ordinary language, but define it and use it in ways based on reality. Now, how to do this, of course, is a question for epistemology, which we'll comment on further. But so much for the alternative of an ideal versus ordinary language. Thank you. Now I'll just have a short break and then a question period. Let me take some that I've been collecting from preceding weeks and comment on them briefly, and then a few on tonight. How do pragmatists justify imagination and hypothetical thinking for the sake of art or science? In other words, without frustrating, perplexing doubt. The pragmatist view is supposed to be that you only think to get out of the dilemma that's caused by some concrete situation. Well, I have heard pragmatists answer that if you're thinking abstractly in art or science, you're doing so because you're intellectually bothered or frustrated. Something baffles you or triggers your interest mentally and you can't resolve the problem, so you do it for the sheer desire to solve the intellectual problem. You're still triggered the mental process by a problem, only it's now an abstract intellectual one. Of course, in giving that answer, the pragmatists are departing entirely from their initial view that all thought is simply a mode of plans of action, or it is to provide you with plans of action. They're departing entirely from their evolutionary basis and simply equivocating, and it amounts to, if you find something interesting, you think about it. But the actual truth should be on a pragmatist view. If you have no practical reason, you shouldn't think at all. Aren't Dewey's ethics seekers consulting absolutes, i.e. reality, when they consult scientists about the consequences inherent in their choices of action? Well, obviously, yes. Causal sequences are facts of reality. So in this respect, as in all others, the pragmatists again are making an implicit appeal to the facts of reality in their ethics, even though of course they deny it. They would simply say, well, but the causal sequences that the scientist gives us are not absolutes. You can't be certain. They've worked up to now. We can't be sure they'll work in the future, etc. But as a matter of fact, of course, insofar as they rely upon causality, they are relying upon correspondence to reality. Question tonight: what does Moore mean by unanalyzable terms, which he says compose ethical statements? Why does he call his ethical theory ethical intuitionism? Well, I left out this aspect of Moore. Moore held that you cannot define any ethical concept you can't define basic ethical concepts in terms of non-ethical concepts. If you take a concept like good, for instance, he held that it is impossible in principle ever to attempt to define that in terms which are reducible to observational fact. You could never define good as that which promotes life or that which promotes pleasure or that which is obedient to society or whatever. And he claimed to give a proof that such definition of basic ethical terms was impossible. And he concluded that ethical terms, the ultimate ones, were in the same category as a term like yellow. A term like yellow stands for a direct given, in this case sensory primary, which you simply directly grasp by your eyes. If you're blind, you can't make anything out of it, but if you're, you could discuss the light waves that cause it and so on, but you can't just grasp the actual experience of yellow. But if you're not blind, you just open your eyes and you look and you see what yellow is, and that's all. Well, Moore said the same type of thing is applicable to basic ethical concepts like good. Good is an irreducible, unanalyzable property, just the way yellow is. Only good happens not to be accessible to our senses, and consequently, it is what he called a non-natural property. It's not the sort of property that we can discover by observation in this world. We have to have an intuition, a direct awareness by a kind of a moral sense of what goodness consists of, and that's what he calls his view intuitionism. And this is really a reversion to Platonism on his part. Now from last week. The statement, a thing can't be A and non-A at the same time in the same respect, means I use the word respect in a certain way. The former statement is a necessary statement, the latter is a contingent one. Since the logical positivists equate the two, aren't they destroying their own distinction between necessary and contingent statements? In essence, I would answer yes to this question. They would say the convention that we use is contingent, but given is up to us, is arbitrary. But given the convention, the truth that comes from it is necessary. That's the way they would answer. They'd say how you use the word respect, your initial decision to use the word a certain way is arbitrary. But given that, then the law of contradiction, for instance, follows as a necessary truth. But then the question is, how do they interpret what they call necessary truths? What are they truths about? Since, according to them, they have no tie to reality and they say nothing. They have no factual content. Well, some of them try to interpret them as saying, the law of contradiction is simply a report on linguistic usage. It simply means people use the word respect in the following way. Well, of course, if so, the way people use the word is a contingent fact. So the alleged necessary truth has become a contingent truth. Some of them say the law of contradiction should be translated as follows, as a recommendation. Let's use the word respect in such a way that we won't call something A and non-A. If we call something A, we won't call it the same respect if we call it non-A. In other words, it's simply a linguistic recommendation. It's neither true nor false, but then, of course, it isn't necessary. In other words, if you follow what I've been saying, I agree with the basic criticism implicit in this question. Conventional necessity is really a contradiction in terms. The conventionalist theory of necessary truth is really a contradiction in terms. To say that the truth is necessary is to say it must be so. To say it's the result of a convention is to say it doesn't have to be so. It's a function of our linguistic choice, which is arbitrary and could have gone the other way. A necessary convention is simply self-contradictory. And of course, it's obvious, I think, that you cannot sustain this position for 30 seconds. If a truth is supposed to be the result of linguistic convention, then it should be possible to alter the truth by altering the convention. But in fact, you cannot do any such thing. If I say to you, all bachelors are unmarried, now that's a classic example of a so-called analytic, non-factual statement. Now, it's supposed to be true simply because of our arbitrary use of the word bachelor. All right, let us say we decide to use the word bachelor differently. Does it then follow that bachelors are married? What we meant by bachelors are married? Can I make all the bachelors in the world have wives by changing my use of the word bachelor? Obviously not. All I can do by changing my use of the word is refer to something different from what I was referring to before. But I can't change the fact that if you're a bachelor, you don't have a wife. And in this sense, you cannot alter the truth of any proposition by your change of usage. All you can do if you change the meaning of the word is talk about something else by that word rather than what you originally talked about. Now here's a question that goes back to John Stuart Mill lecture. Is there a difference between Aristotle's each man pursues some good and Mill's all men seek pleasure? Well, yes, for one thing, Aristotle held that there was a metaphysical basis for this, that everything that existed was striving to actualize its distinctive potentialities, and he thought that he could defend that on general metaphysical grounds, that everything was striving for its fulfillment, and that therefore man was a particular case of that. Secondly, Aristotle did not equate the ultimate goal that he thought all men were striving for with pleasure. His actual term for the ultimate goal that all men were striving for was eudaimonia, which is roughly translated as happiness, but means more than simply feeling good. He uses it in a very general way, but it amounts to kind of full, rich, uninhibited life on earth in which you enjoy yourself, your mind functions, you act successfully, you have a certain amount of money, a decent appearance, some friends, you live in or at least partly free country. In other words, it's a kind of full, rich, happy life on earth. It's more than simply a series of shots of pleasure, which is what the Millian interpretation was. In this sense, there was a difference between Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia, or happiness, and Mill's view that all men pursue pleasure. It remains true, however, that it's still the case that Aristotle does base his ethics on the claim that all men seek happiness, and I think that claim is in principle subject to the same type of objections as we gave to psychological hedonism, and therefore I do not think that Aristotle provided a basis for an objective ethics. And of course, I may say, in fairness to him, he didn't think so either. He said at the beginning of his ethics that he did not know how to make ethics scientific. He did not think it could be made scientific by his knowledge, and therefore all he was going to do was confine himself to common sense observations about how decent people behave, which he did very well. But if you took his ethics as a formal, as an attempt at formal proof, it does not hold up. If, I'm trying to get some of these from the preceding weeks that have been collected, if there is no distinction between the mental and the physical in pragmatist terms, how can the Dewey-Peirce school invalidate emotions as a guide to the meaningful? Remember, we distinguished the Dewey-Peirce school, according to which only factors which are universal to a group are allowed as criteria of the meaningful or of the what works, as against the James school, which allowed individual emotions. And now he says if there is no distinction between the mental and the physical, how can the Dewey-Peirce school invalidate emotions? Well, of course, the answer is they don't like that particular element. They're influenced by Kant, and they want the collective subjectivism. But the questioner anticipates that and goes on. In their assertion of the collective as the basis for what works, aren't Dewey-Peirce really admitting an individual emotional preference for that approach? And I would say that the answer to that question is yes. Since pragmatists have no objective basis, if they decide to not count or not allow in individual emotions, since the whole thing rests ultimately on arbitrary emotional whims, that simply is a personal emotional whim of theirs. And therefore, in that sense, they are simply subjectively dislike James's subjectivism, which is what it comes to. In the example you cited, this is again on logical positivism, John has eaten arsenic. Arsenic is poisonous. Therefore, John has eaten poison. Wouldn't a positivist say that since you have made a logical deduction, your conclusion has nothing to say about reality? No. the positivist would say your conclusion, John has eaten poison, is verifiable, at least on some version of the verifiability principle. We can watch and see what happens to him. What is detached from reality is the inferential principle that you used. In other words, if you say, if A is B and B is C, then A is C, that statement as a whole, that law of logic, is detached from reality and says nothing. And so if I utter the whole statement, if John has eaten arsenic and arsenic is poisonous, then John has eaten poison, that statement as a whole says nothing about reality because it's a necessary truth. If I simply come in and say John has eaten poison, that is a contingent truth and therefore can say something about reality. What do we have here? Do questions make statements about facts of reality, or is it sufficient to say that they refer to fact? Well, of course, they refer to fact, but I would say that implicitly they also make statements about fact. I don't know what else there is to make statements about. Now, if I say, what time is it? As I understand that, I am saying something. That I would like you to give me a certain piece of information. And it simply is a linguistic shorthand that instead of having to say, I would like you now to give me a certain piece of information, which is a fact, you see, I simply short-circuit that and put a question mark, which is a convention to indicate that I want something from you. But if the fact is still, I want that information from you. And I don't see the distinction here between making a statement about a fact or referring to a fact. I would say a question, in the sense I indicated, does make statements about facts. Can the concept fact ever be used properly to describe the epistemological status of an idea, such as hypothesis, theory, law, etc.? Or is fact restricted only to the field of metaphysics? Well, in its primary usage, the concept fact is restricted to external reality. And in that sense, a fact is any aspect of reality. And it's distinguished, therefore, from a hypothesis, a theory, a law, etc. If we take by law here meaning a theory of what the law is. But there is an aspect from which you can say, after all, consciousness is part of reality, and its contents are part of reality. And therefore, one aspect of a consciousness may be that it holds a certain theory. It is then a fact that that consciousness holds that theory. And in this sense, you can apply the term fact to the content of consciousness. You can say it's a fact that he feels this emotion, that he has this theory, that he believes this idea, etc. So it's all right to apply the term fact to the contents of consciousness if all you mean is to say there are certain facts, namely certain contents of consciousness. What is misleading and what you have to be careful is that you don't implicitly equivocate, using fact in one sense simply to mean a certain idea exists, and then equivocate and jump over to the meaning that idea is therefore true to fact in the sense of corresponds to the facts of reality. As long as you don't make that equivocation, there's nothing wrong with applying the term fact to the contents of consciousness. Is there any validity in the theory that one's language and its grammar determines or limits one's mental activity or thinking? As I've formulated it this evening, there is no validity to that. If you have a language such as English, there is no delimitation on your mental activity or thinking which is thrust upon you by English. What is certainly true is that if we take language at a very primitive state, at a time when they only have a very small vocabulary, then you obviously cannot think advanced thoughts if, you're at the stage in the development where you can say bone, red and green and cave and rain and so on, and you can utter simple sentences. Perhaps you get a little farther than the logical Adam has got in the caveman stage, but if you're at that primitive stage of knowledge, obviously there's a terrific limit to the thinking that you can do. You couldn't conceive the theory of relativity. But then it's not the language that you use that's causing you the trouble, it's your lack of knowledge. It's the fact that there's a whole wealth of concepts that you haven't yet formed, a whole immense field of sensory data that you haven't yet integrated into conceptual form, and therefore you're ignorant. Now, if you ask the question, does ignorance place limits on your mental activities? Obviously it places limits, and you have to acquire the knowledge. But that would be the only sensible way to ask this question. There's nothing in the language you use or its grammar as such which limits your mental ability to think. All that limits your mental ability is a lack of knowledge, which may be reflected in a limited vocabulary. What is an operational theory of meaning, and what school of philosophy holds it? It is a variant of the verifiability theory held by positivists in physics, mostly. Bridgman was the author of this particular theory. It simply is a variant of the verifiability theory, but its particular variant is to say a term means the operations by which you would measure it. A term means the operations by which you would measure it. So, for instance, what is the meaning of length according to this view? Well, you can measure length by various astronomical means, and you can measure length by taking a foot rule and putting one across the other and so on. Well, they say length as measured by foot rules means something different from length as measured by astronomical methods, because the term means the sum of the operations by which it's measured. I left it out in my reference to the verifiability theory last week because it has less plausibility than the variance that I mentioned last week. It really is essentially the verifiability theory applied to physics. Let's see if we can get one short one. How about this as a finale? If statements do not refer to facts, how is it possible to analyze their usage? That's a good question. Words which have no reference are empty sounds. Such an idea of language makes analysis impossible. Well, of course, I agree perfectly with the criticism implicit here. You are supposed to analyze concepts without subscribing to the view that concepts have got any connection to reality. Well, what are you supposed to do? Well, as it ends up, the way these people practices it is they do have a connection between words and reality, but the reality is not metaphysical reality, but people. And therefore, their analysis consists of saying people speak, and this is how they speak. So in that sense, even they can't escape some facts, only they ignore the question, what are people's statements, what are they based on, how are they related to reality, and proceed to spin their analyses within this private world of linguistic usages. But the essence of this objection I certainly agree to. I'll look over some of the others for 2 weeks from tonight. For now, let's draw a line. Thank you.
This course continues with Lecture 10.